Welcome to Ground Control, and I have a new item for review. Okay, it's not put together yet, but it will be. And it is a Dancing Wings Hobby PITTS 450 millimeter Wingspan 3D brushless biplane. This is courtesy of Banggood. I want to thank Banggood for sending this for review. I have been wanting to review one of the Dancing Wings Hobby's foam planes for a long time, and now I have an opportunity to do so. Now this is a complete bind and fly kit. You don't have to order a bind and fly kit. You can order just the airframe assembly if you wish to do that. You can order the airframe assembly and the servos. You can order the airframe assembly, the servos, and the motor. You can order the airframe assembly, the servos, the motor, and the receiver if you choose to do so. I have the bind and fly, so it includes everything, including the receiver. The only thing it doesn't include is the LiPo. The LiPo that is recommended is 150 to 250 milliamp hour 2S LiPo. Well, I don't have one of those, but I do have some 300s. So I'm going to be using some 300 milliamp hour LiPos in this plane. It might make it 2 or 3 grams heavier than a 250, but that's what I've got. That's what I'm going to use. It comes with everything. I really like the way they did this. There's not going to be any soldering required for the electronic components. It comes with a 2 gram servo for the ailerons, 1.7 gram servo for the elevator and the rudder, so you get 3 servos with it. It comes with carbon rods with steel Z-bend links that you have to put together with heat shrink. Comes with the motor mount. Comes with an 1106 3800 kV motor, and I love the connectors they have on this. Connectors are already attached to the motor and already attached to the pigtail that you put into the ESC on the receiver. And this is a 6-channel receiver. It is a non-gyro receiver. It's just manual mode. So if you guys want to fly this with a gyro receiver, then you probably want to get the kit, the motor, the servos, and then purchase your own gyro receiver separately. But I like the manual mode receivers. But it looks like 0.5 millimeter bullet connectors is what it looks like they have on this motor. That's what it reminds me of. And then of course the female connector on the pigtail that goes into the ESC on the receiver, and it has a 7 amp 2S ESC built into the receiver. The receivers come in several protocols. So mine is a DSM2, DSM-X, but they have Fly Sky, they have Free Sky, they have FSHSS, I think is the protocol. They also have available. So 7 amp speed controller built into it for 2S power. That's awesome. So I like that. I don't think I'm going to run into any problems with that. It comes with a prop saver for the motor. It comes with it looks like a standard, I don't know, it might be a 4 millimeter hub. 50-30 prop with a prop saver, but the motor can also use, a T-mount 50-30 prop. So I think, when I test it out to begin with, when I do the maiden flight, probably +1, I'll use the standard prop with a prop saver on it, and then I think I'll also test it out with a T-mount 50-30 prop. See which one works better. I think the T-mount prop is going to be a little bit lighter than this one. Might be able to spin it a little bit faster, but we'll see. Comes with everything. Now the prep work for the component, for the parts before you start assembling them, and it comes with a color brochure that has a pretty nice, step-by-step color pictures. Build guide for you. So I'm not going to go through every step of the build process, but I want to go through things that I do ahead of time before I start assembling, and also some tips on your build and looking at the steps on the build process. I'm going to do some things that are going to be out of order from the way they do it in here, because I think it's just going to be a little bit easier. But make sure that you have all of your little punch outs, what I call them, the little pieces that are perforated that need to come out of each component. There's not a lot of pieces to the airframe, so it's going to be a pretty straightforward build. The only thing that you're going to have to remove, I think, from the fuselage is the rudder. You're going to have to remove the rudder from the fuselage to get the horizontal stabilizer installed in the slot, because it's just too wide. So the rudder is going to end up being a tape hinge. But the elevator and the ailerons are going to be foam hinges. And so what I recommend is that you work these hinges back and forth before you start assembling the plane, so that it's not so stiff, and so it's not making the servos work as hard to move the control surfaces. So I just work those back and forth until it takes a lot less effort to move the control surface back and forth. Same thing with the ailerons on the two wings. Just move your control surfaces back and forth to free up those foam hinges, so there's not a lot of resistance. Do that ahead of time. Now on the foam hinges where the ailerons are, I did have some little pieces of foam that were not completely trimmed out of these little voids in between the little foam hinges, so I just took an X-Acto knife and trimmed those out. And I recommend that you go through all the components and do that. Make sure there's no obstructions, make sure everything is nice and smooth. You don't want anything to obstruct your control surfaces. Dry fit the three sections of the fuselage together ahead of time before you glue anything together, and make sure that all the slots and everything line up properly before you ever glue anything together. Now I'm going to use a couple of different types of glue, and all mine line up. Everything lines up perfectly on my fuselage. But make sure that you dry fit everything together. Make sure that you dry fit your lower wing into the fuselage before you glue your fuselage together. In case you have to adjust any of those cutouts, make them a little bit wider if you need to. Okay, so when I put it together, I'm going to do a couple of different things. I'm going to use either foam tack or foam cure to put the components together, because it's a lot lighter weight than using like a hot glue. So whatever foam safe glue you're going to use, I'm going to use foam tack or foam cure. But what I'm going to do is once I get the part glued in using the foam cure and the foam tack, what I'm going to do, especially like with the wings and with the horizontal stabilizer and with the struts that hold the wings in, I'm going to take some hot glue and I'm going to tack them in place so that I make sure that I have my wing, my horizontal stabilizer perfectly level, using a little plastic square. Make sure that everything is completely level when I tack it on the outside with hot glue, so that I don't have to set and brace it and wait for the foam tack or the foam cure to set up. I'm going to use the hot glue to hold everything in place while the foam tack and the foam cure set up, and that way it'll make the build process go a lot faster and also keep everything nice and lightweight, because using a lot of hot glue will increase the weight of the airframe. And I want to keep everything as light as possible. And it comes with little foam wheels. You get two different sections that are going to be glued together. You'll have a carbon rod strut that goes in between the wheels where it attaches on the bottom, and then you'll have the braces attached to the fuselage. So one of the things that I'm going to do differently than what they have in the instructions is they tell you to cut off the vertical stabilizer, and then they tell you to cut off the vertical stabilizer and then bevel 45 degrees. what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it over and take my X-Acto blade, and then I'm going to put the 45-degree bevel in it before I separate it from the fuselage. It's just easier for me to do it that way than have it on a flat surface and try to hold the X-Acto blade at a 45-degree angle. It's easier for me to just fold it over, take the X-Acto blade, and cut the 45-degree angle, and then once I have that done, then I will separate it from the fuselage once I make sure that I get enough deflection with that bevel in both directions before I separate it, and then I'll reattach it with a tape hinge once I get the horizontal stabilizer glued into it. So anyway, do your prep work on the components first, dry fit it, and then I'll bring the camera in and we'll start gluing stuff together. Okay, so I have my X-Acto blade and we are ready to create our 45-degree bevel on our rudder. And I'm just going to come across at a 45-degree angle on the rudder side, not on the fuselage side. Wow, that's some tough foam. Alright, let's try it from this direction. It just kind of like it gums up. And I just sharpened this too. Wow. That is something else. Okay, that's not very pretty. Oh well, we'll repair it. Alright, so now that I screwed that up, what we're going to do is we're going to take our foam cure and we're going to apply it to this half of the fuselage, get everything lined up. I've got two pieces of wax paper here, one underneath, one will go on the top, and then we're going to weight it down to keep everything nice and straight. So let me go ahead and get out my glue. And I'm going to go around the edges of the fuselage first. And I've got some scrap pieces of foam to use as a squeegee. Now I'm just going to take my squeegee and I'm going to spread it more evenly across the entire surface. Okay, now we've got that covered very well. We're going to get it lined up. Make sure your motor mount lines up. Make sure all of your cutouts line up. Make sure the slot at the horizontal stabilizer lines up. And adjust everything until you get it right where it needs to be. And then I'm just going to squeegee along the bottom of it for any excess glue that kind of comes out after I compress it together. Make sure it's nice and flat. And I think that looks good. Also make sure that you don't get any glue squirting out in the slot for your servo and where your wing is going to attach. Alright, that looks fairly clean. Now we're going to put the wax paper over the top. We'll put this flat box on top of it. And then I'm just going to put some weight on top to make sure everything stays flat. Okay, well, we're waiting for our fuselage to set up. Now we're going to go ahead and fill our channels in our top and lower wing with some glue, and then install our carbon slats for reinforcement. Always make sure that you dry fit those. They weren't seating completely into the foam. I had a bit of a ridge up here, so I just used a piece, the edge of the carbon slat, and kind of pushed the foam down a bit. Now on the main wing, don't push down very hard, because on the main wing I actually separated it. So if that happens to you, where you actually separate the foam where the channel is, just use a couple of pieces of painter's tape to close the gap up before you fill it with glue. That'll take care of it. The glue sets up, everything will be fine. And make sure that you have some wax paper underneath and on the top so that you're not getting glue on your cutting surface. So I'm going to go ahead and fill my channel with glue, and then I'm going to put the carbon slat in. Okay. Now squeegee the excess off of the top. Now put my wax paper on the top. Something flat. Hold it down level and some weight. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing with the lower wing. And I noticed that on the two carbon slats that come with the horizontal stabilizer, both of these carbon slats are a little bit longer than the channel is for the carbon slats. You've got one, a short one that goes in the elevator and one that goes into the forward portion of the elevator to make it rigid. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a Dremel tool with a cutting wheel and slice off about 5 millimeters off the end of each one of these, and then I will get those installed in the horizontal stabilizer and the elevator, and then when those are set up we'll proceed to the next step. I have gone ahead and glued in the horizontal stabilizer elevator assembly. I have created a tape hinge for the rudder. I would recommend that you attach your control horn to your elevator before attaching it to the fuselage. It will make it easier. I have my servos installed. Before I installed my servos, before I installed the motor and motor mount, I made sure I could bind up to the receiver. I made sure all my servos were working properly, the motor was working properly, and that I had my servos all centered up before I installed them. So I got all those centered up and then went ahead and installed them in the plane. I just put a little bit of glue under each one of the tabs. In the instructions it tells you to cut off the tabs on the aileron servo when you install the aileron servo. I'm not going to do that. I use the tabs to glue the servo in place, and I brought the lead up along the back side of the servo because I'm going to have the receiver on the right hand side, and I want that to come up, connect to the receiver, and be able to tie it down to the side of the fuselage. So I'm just waiting on my servos, the glue to cure and the installation of the servos, and then I'm going to go ahead and connect the elevator and the rudder linkage, set everything up in a neutral position before I install the lower wing. And while I am doing that, you've got these little tiny nylon pieces. You punch those out, and these actually provide a way to link the lower wing ailerons with the upper wing ailerons, and so those just have like a little saddle mount. So I'm going to glue those in with foam cure and then put a little tiny dab of hot glue on each side, on the top and on the bottom, to make those as nice and snug and rigid as possible. So I will install those on both of the ailerons on the lower wing and both of the ailerons in the upper wing. And then once all that is set up, then I'll install the wing into the fuselage. Now you want to make sure with the lower wing that you only install one of those nylon pieces in one side. You're going to install the other one after you get the wing installed in the fuselage. If you install both of them, you're not going to be able to slide it through. Okay, and my recommendation for the rudder, you saw how much problem I had trying to bevel that while it was in place. You need an extremely thin blade for that. I would recommend a razor blade, because even with a sharpened X-Acto blade, this foam is really, spongy, and you try to cut it and it just moves away from the blade, and so I really ended up with a jagged edge on that bevel on the rudder. So my recommendation would be go ahead and disconnect the rudder from the fuselage, and then put a steel ruler or something over the top of it, and then use your blade to make the 45-degree bevel. And having that steel ruler on the top will prevent it from flexing so much when you're cutting your bevel, because that stuff is really difficult to cut because it wants to move away from the blade like a piece of rubber. Now that should make it very durable, but it does make it very difficult to cut. One issue that I ran into as far as quality issue on the build is the control horns. On all the micro control horns, all 4 of them, they each have 2 holes for your linkage, and they were all capped on the back side of the control horn, so I had to actually drill those out before I installed them. So make sure you check all that type of stuff before you ever install it, because you never know. It's a lot easier to fix those things while they're out of the plane rather than in the plane. So that's where I am right now at this point in the build process. My electronics, everything tested okay. I've got it set up in the RadioMaster TX16S. Once I get the linkage and everything connected to it, once the airframe is all put together and I've got all the linkage connected, then I will set up my dual rates and expo for the maiden launch. Okay, so stay tuned for review part 2, build part 2, and in the next video we will complete the build and have the setup complete. It'll be ready for its glide test to validate the CG. And then after that, we'll take it out for the maiden launch +1. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the air.